Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a great topic. I'm not sure we've ever had a blah blah. 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a panel discussion. The topic is weird early albums that are better than you think. Martin's here. We've got a great panel. Let's do it. Let's get started. Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a great topic. This is something I don't think we've covered on this channel, but we're going to look at weird early albums by bands that are a lot better than you think. So basically the premise is there are plenty of bands that started off early and they morphed into something else, and that morphization is really what everybody is familiar with. So we're going to look at this, and we're going to keep it loose. We're going to go an hour. We'll see how many times we can go around. And I want to welcome the panel tonight. We've got Jeff, we've got Phil, we've got David, and of course Martin and myself. And we're just going to have a nice discussion. We do want to hear from you in the chat. So let us know if we don't hit something. We want to hear from you if there's a band that, hey, well, they sounded like this on this record, but now they sound totally different. So do you guys, let's just go one round at a time each time and go around 3 times or something. I'm going to start off with Jeff. I'm going to go to Phil, David, Martin, and I'm just hosting this one, but it depends. I may have to throw some out later, but I'll let everybody have their shot first. All right, Jeff, you're up. What's your first one?
All right, I'm going to get this out here before anybody takes it. Yes. Those first 2 Yes albums, I absolutely really like them. They are good albums. They don't have anything to do with what Yes got known to be, sounding like. But there's quality stuff on there. There really is. And there's a nice Beatles cover. Sorry, Grant. But
yeah, but Yes does a good job at it. There are certain bands I give a pass. I give Yes a pass, Aerosmith a pass, but not many.
I also really liked the Buffalo Springfield cover. And I would be more, covering Stephen Stills. You don't cover Stephen Stills. I actually really like Stills, but it works. It works. So anyway, that's my pick. Yes.
All right. Cool. All right, Phil, you're up.
Right. Okay. Thanks for having me, guys. Always great to be here on a panel. It's been a while since I did one. I'm going to cheat a bit, and I'm going to do this according to categories I've made. And my first category is what we would call US power metal. And I'm thinking not of just one group. I am thinking of 3 groups. I'm thinking of Queensryche. I'm thinking of Fate's Warning and of Dream Theater, early period of these bands, right? So, for instance, we would have here the Dream Theater demos with, what's his name again? With Chris Collins on the vocals, the very, very first singer of the band. I'm thinking of Queensryche, of course, with Warning and their famous eponymous EP. And Fate's Warning, I have no physical copies because I could never stand the voice of John Arch, which was too nasal and too high for me. Not in the style like Geddy Lee, but just kind of too nasal and shrieky almost. Although those early period albums by Fate's Warning, Awaken the Guardian, Spectre Within, and Night on Brocken are considered by many as worthy and equal to the albums where they established their sound. So basically all these 3 bands, we have Dream Theater here with their famous debut When Dream and Day Unite with that ridiculous cover. And basically in all these 3 bands you can hear the sound of progressive metal. You can see where they would be going on later. Taking forward the genre of prog metal, especially with Queensryche, with the album that really starts it all, which is Rage for Order, and then later on, of course, Operation Mindcrime. But these early albums, they display a sort of tendency towards this thing that we call US power metal. So, galloping rhythms, very rather straightforward kind of heavy metal with these big operatic shrieking voices. You have, of course, Jeff Tate in Queensryche. Chris Collins in Dream Theater was also that type of like Geddy Lee type of voice. And you have obviously also Fate's Warning. But to be honest, for me and for most of us, it all starts later on with Queensryche, Rage for Order. For Fate's Warning, we could really say that it all starts with this album here, Perfect Symmetry, with the arrival of Ray Alder on vocals in the place of John Arch, and of course with Dream Theater, Hero to Say, the famous Images and Words. That's where all things start, with the arrival of James Labrie in the place of Charlie Dominici, who was singing on the debut album, also from that kind of school of high-pitched voices. And there you could see the musical change in Dream Theater, going to something more lyrical, melodic, very close to Marillion and Rush, and not so much in this realm of power metal, galloping kind of darker music, just like with early Queensryche and so forth. So that's my first three choices, first category, so to speak, and I'll leave it on to David. Yeah.
Nice.
All right, cool.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of noise, and it could be from any of them, but it might be yours, Phil. So if you could hit mute, Phil,
yes,
we'll see if it's from yours that is coming from. Yeah, it was yours. Okay. All right.
And I would like to say, actually, that's interesting. I would have liked Queensryche to stick with that direction they were on the EP. As good as Mindcrime and Rage for Order are, I kind of like the earlier stuff better. But the real interesting part about that is the only Fate's Warning I ever had, I think, was a really early one. And I sort of dismissed them, I checked them out. I think I remember reading, I don't even remember what you said about them, Martin, but I remember reading in your 500 heavy metal or whatever that came out many years ago about that band, but I did not know that they changed their sound that much. So I at least would kind of like to know what them sounding better, because that recording was kind of rough. I'd kind of like to know what it sounds like. I don't know if I'd like them or not. I'm not really a prog metal guy, but it'd be worth, they had some ideas. It'd be worth checking out. So this is Grant doing his thing. I just learned something new about music from you. So thanks.
Nice.
Okay. My first is going to be Genesis. Their first album from Genesis to Revelation from '69 is drastically different than what they would get into later on. I mean, Peter Gabriel even spoke about how he was influenced by a lot of the early Bee Gees and Robin Gibb vocal on like the song Silent Sun. And they were kind of going for that. It's a little pop. It's a little psychedelic. I think at the time, Mike Rutherford joked that the album only sold like 649 copies. So it's not an album that really people go to a lot because it's drastically different. Obviously, it has no Steve Hackett or Phil Collins on it. And the idea of what the kind of prog band they would become later in the 70s, you can hear it a little bit, but it's definitely when they get to Trespass, the album after, with songs like The Knife, I think you can see where they were going. And then by the time they get to Foxtrot, that's pretty much the template for the next few albums after that. But yeah, one interesting fact about this album is that Tom Allen was actually an engineer on it, and he obviously went on to engineer the first three Sabbath records, and then he produced all the Priest records of the 80s. But yeah, it's I don't go back to this album often, but it's definitely, there are a couple songs on it that kind of stand out to me in the Genesis catalog.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Cool.
Excellent.
Classic choice. Absolutely.
All right, Martin, you're up.
Okay, my first one is the Boomtown Rats. So I'm going with, the funny thing is, so there's the debut. That's kind of what we're talking about here. I'm missing the best one, but the second one is this one. And the debut is really the only punky one. And you get some more here. And then back up to the end, up to, these are the later ones. And then they've reunited as well. But I'm missing the Fine Art of Surfacing here. But Boomtown Rats is my strongest choice because it's a one. If I went early, there's another band I would have had stuck in for 2. But what I like about the Boomtown Rats situation is that first album is pretty bare bones, but well recorded. It's an early Mutt Lange recording, actually. Let me hold it up again there. Get your Bob Geldof all wrapped up, kind of looking like Iggy Pop. You got the band on the back, all shrink wrapped there. But essentially, this is a really clean, polite, corporately well recorded punk rock album, essentially. And then the next album, Tonic for the Troops, I remember getting that, thinking, oh man, this title, Tonic for the Troops, is gonna rock, eh? And you look at the cover and it looks really, it looks super poppy. I mean, that's what the band looks like on the second one. And boy, those are not hard rocking instruments there. And what are we in for here? We got a banjo, we got two acoustic guitars, and it was quite poppy, a big change of pace for them. So, the funny thing with this topic is, I don't know which one of these is particularly the highly respected era of the band. Boomtown Rats, probably it's the third album and somewhat the second album, but the reputation actually goes down after that. After the second and third album, you'd probably go back to the first album and say that is the one that people like anyways. But it is definitely an early sound that is different from the later sound. And I thought I'd go a little bit later. Because I figured Genesis might get taken and Yes might get taken. But I can think of another one as well that's a really pronounced one that we'll mention at the honorable mentions when we get there. But yeah, Boomtown Rats, love the punk album. Love the next 2 albums as well. It starts going down from there because they really start experimenting. But that first one is heavy, it's riffy, it's fast, it's punk, but it's really well recorded by Mutt Lange.
Excellent. All right, I've got one. I'm just going to do it. I can rally, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
But I bet Martin's got this. I know he has to have this in his back pocket. I'm going to go with a band that's one of my all-time favorite bands of all time. The first 2 albums are totally different than what came later because they had lineup change. By 1979, the keyboards are out, the guitar is in, and it totally changed their sound. But those first 2 records, I think, are well worth checking out. Both of them came out in 1978. The first one came out January 20th, White Music, which is the debut. And then the second album, Go To, came out in 1978. Later that year, October 6th, I'm going to go with XTC. And those records, I would say post-punk, pop, a different blend of stuff, but not quite as herky-jerky as what came on Drums and Wires in 1979. Once they got Dave Gregory on board, man, that XTC was born. But also, of course, we have different producers too. We've got, by the time we have, Drums and Wires, we've got Steve Lillywhite, who was around for Black Sea as well. But I mean, they do change, but this band constantly morphed. As they became a studio band, their sound constantly changed. But I think the classic XTC sound was born on Drums and Wires. But that would be my pick. So nice, there you go.
Very cool. All right, Jeff's up, and take your mute off there, Jeff.
Thanks for reminding me. Let me just. All right, before somebody else gets to this, Journey. I actually really like the first 3 albums, the third one especially. And then they got Steve Perry, and they turned into a completely different band.
Yeah.
Some of these are going to be because of producers. Some of them are going to be lineup changes. Some of them are strictly just the band deciding to change direction. With Journey, and at least one of my honorable mentions later, they got a different singer that was more capable, and they decided to do different sorts of music with it. There's nothing wrong with Journey. I'm not really a big fan of the ballads, but I don't like ballads mostly anyway. I'm just that way. But I really like that kind of cross between, it's almost proggy, it's a little jazzy. It's still rock, though. It's not fusion. It's not really prog. That's a sweet spot for me. Stuff that lives in that. And in fact, I think the Yes pick actually kind of fits in that spot. And my third pick is going to fit in that spot unless somebody takes it. So that's my second pick is Journey. I think those albums are just really, really good. And if I hadn't had a friend who knew about them, I probably still wouldn't know that those were out there, because another thing that happens with this is some of these early albums that are, the early Weird albums, is that the band completely disavows them later. Like anybody on the street, you just ask them to name some Journey songs, they are never going to get to anything off the first three albums. They don't know they exist. And
True.
they're not played on a live album. They're nothing. Just like this never happened. We don't want to talk about it. So that's I don't know. I think that's probably true. Yes, too, isn't it? I don't think those songs from those first two albums got played.
Well, time and a word.
You wouldn't believe the set list from 2 nights ago in Toronto here. Man, they started out with Machine Messiah, and then every other song wasn't a very long set. There were only like 6 or 7 more songs, but every other song was just classic 70s. Yes, there was nothing from John Davison, nothing from Jeff Downes other than Machine Messiah, nothing from Billy Sherwood, like Open Your Eyes or anything like that, and then nothing from the drummer. The drummer's new, right? So it was all Steve Howe, but literally they played one song that one guy was involved with out of the 4 guys besides Steve Howe, and that was Machine Messiah. So yeah, crazy set list, and just all kind of deep classics, right? Long songs.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I saw them a couple years ago. They were great, but yeah, totally different kind of animal. All right, cool. Thanks, Jeff. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Phil, you're up.
All right, second choice, a bit different this time. Let's say my category here is British blues boom / space rock, and I'm gonna go with one of my favorite proto metal bands, who are UFO. And of course, UFO are very well known and admired for albums like Phenomenon, Obsession, what else? Lights Out, so many albums, right? And with Michael Schenker. But before all that, they had 2 albums, their debut album and their sophomore album, UFO 1 and UFO 2, Flying / An Hour of Space Rock. So on their first 2 albums, before the arrival of Michael Schenker, where you had Phil Mogg, of course, on voice, Mick Bolton on guitar, Pete Way, of course, on the bass, and Andy Parker on drums, the band basically played some kind of blend of this British blues booms with a lot of elements of space rock. Their first album, I think, is pretty hard rocking. I like how fast it is, how full of energy it is. It has a certain bravado to it, and I really like some tunes like Melinda. What else is there? I forget the other tunes, but it generally has a dynamism to it. You can hear something there from where they would go on later on. That kind of raw energy, the bluesiness, which kind of transforms into this rock thing, and some space rock. Their second album, Flying, that's not so much up my alley because I'm not a huge fan of space rock. Although I'm sure Hawkwind are maybe more like what I would prefer to listen to in terms of space rock. But this record, Flying, has one tune, Starstorm, that lasts 18 minutes, and one that lasts, I think, 26 minutes. And, it has a lot of bluesiness and rock kind of going through it, but also a lot of this kind of weird spacey stuff that we often associate with this genre, like of space rock, and it kind of meanders too much, and it's a bit too experimental, too far out for me. I prefer, obviously, UFO when they really come to life with Phenomenon and on up to like No Heavy Petting. Which else? I think, Martin, your favorite album of theirs.
I like all the Tonka stuff. No Place to Run, Wild Willie,
No Place to Run,
Mechanics. Making
No Place to
Contact.
Run. Yeah. All of that. But their early albums are really cool. They're very interesting to see to get an idea of that period, where, I mean, early Rush with their first album was a bit in that kind of Led Zeppelin, British blues boom thing. The first album of Jethro Tull, is also kind of a bit of that British blues boom. Like many bands cut their teeth by playing this kind of blues rock thing before they morphed into something more mature and original. And I think UFO is a great example of that. So there you go.
Nice. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example.
Yeah,
Like
definitely.
night and day.
Flying, the 1 Hour Space Rock. I just like that album a lot.
Yeah, I know you're a fan of space rock. You've mentioned Hawkwind also many times.
Sure.
Damn hippie. Damn
right.
dirty hippie. What?
I said, damn right.
All right, let's throw it over to David. David, what's up? What's your next one?
My next one is going to be Renaissance. Their first album from 1969, and then their second album from 1971. I mean, they featured a drastically different lineup than the classic period. Basically, when the Yardbirds disbanded, Jim McCarty and Keith Relf moved on. They wanted to go in more of a classical direction, so they enlisted Keith's sister Jane to do a lot of the lead vocals on this. And and when you listen to those first albums, I mean, the production it's definitely dated for the time, but she had a very high, kind of almost angelic quality to her voice, and she actually got introduced to Betty Thatcher, who would go on to write a lot of the lyrics for the albums during the classic period, pretty much up through 1978. But yeah, John Hawken, the piano player who actually just died back in May, for me, his playing on those albums, those first two especially, really, that's what kind of stands out for me. When I go back and listen to them now, that's what I pick up on. But and obviously, when Annie Haslam joins the band in 1972, they become a completely different vibe. But Michael Dunford starts writing a lot of the material, and they have a pretty fruitful partnership. I mean, songs or albums like Prologue and Ashes Are Burning, those become kind of like the classic period that Renaissance is known for. But those early albums, definitely, if you like that type of classical elements to the prog, there's definitely stuff worth looking for there.
Excellent. Cool.
Nice.
All right, Martin, you're up.
All right. Well, I have a theme going here. I decided to make it a theme because it's a trio. So I went with the only heavy punk album from Canada, from the punk era. So this is 1977. They were signed to CBS in Canada. And oddly enough, this is very much like the Boomtown Rats situation because it's a really, really well-recorded power chord punk album. Every single song on here is basically guitar, bass, and drums, with distortion pedal. The vocals are a little not super punked out, not super aggressive. But yeah, every song is basically quite heavy on this. So they put out this album. This is a Toronto band. They put this out in 1977. And then they only made 2 other albums. This is their second one. And or maybe this might be the third. Anyways, they had 2 more still on Epic, and they went poppy. They basically did exactly what the Boomtown Rats did. And then here's a compilation that you can get of everything on here as well. And there's a little picture. Actually, I won't get it out. But anyways, they only made 2 other albums. But I thought when I was putting this together, I wanted to really live by the one album and then change kind of thing. And I thought that was another good case. But they literally, it's the exact same blueprint as the Boomtown Rats for that one. But yeah, check that album out. It's on Spotify, actually, the first album. I think they probably all are, but I was playing it today. Check out that first Diodes album. It's a good heavy punk album for 1977.
All right, cool. There you go. Hey, we're just here trying to turn you on to stuff, so go check that out. If you know those records, we want to hear from you in the comments. So without any further, there you go. Check that out. We want to hear what you think of that record. All right, I'm going to go with a band, an early 90s band, came out in 1993. They had another record that came out in 95. These were, you might say, the first 2 albums are a lot more rooted in the whole grunge era, alternative grunge. And really, those first 2 albums, after they hit their third album, they never they never looked back. They never did sound like this again. So the first two records we're talking are Pablo Honey, and the second album's The Bends, and we're talking Radiohead. My personal favorite Radiohead album is OK Computer, because then they have, ladies and gentlemen, they have left the building, and they've left that grunge. I'd say that they opened up that door to alternative, to avant-garde, though. But I think OK Computer is the perfect blend of maybe some of that earlier period and anything that came later. But OK Computer, Kid A, very experimental electronic music, avant-garde. There's all these tendencies. Try to classify Radiohead, please. It's very hard to do. But they are not a grunge band anymore. They're not really an alternative band. They're completely something else. So by the time they get to OK Computer. So there you go.
But I have to ask there, because I love Radiohead, and I love the Bends, especially. I was in a band and we played a few covers from that album. I really enjoyed that. I mean, those two first albums are kind of grungy into that alley you mentioned, but after that, what was the sound of Radiohead? Did they ever establish an actual sound that is theirs? Because each album is a far cry from.
I don't know. When I think Radiohead, I think OK Computer is what I think. Or Kid A, anything in that middle period, because they're still doing songs. A lot of that later stuff, I'm not even sure. I'm not sure what I'd even call it. But I think there's sounds on OK Computer and Kid A, as far as I'm concerned. In my monkey brain, that's what I think.
Hail to the Thief, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Oh, I'm going out there, ladies and gentlemen. Tell me I'm wrong down in the comments, but we're talking music. So, but that's where I hear them. Now, if I hear something new, well, the thing is, at least on OK Computer and Kid A, they're still within that realm. Now, when I hear them, are they growing? It just seems kind of like it's more the same of what they built off of, in that later period. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm not hearing something, but they had that good middle period, which I think is absolutely brilliant, So, and I think that's it. I think that's my mind. That's what I think. So, all right, cool. Jeff, we're back to you.
All right. I could have done a fill here because I've got three things all kind of in the same category. And I'm surprised nobody's taken this yet, but Deep Purple. There's such a difference between what anybody knows and what's on the first really 4 records, but I'm mostly talking about the first 3 because the concerto was kind of its own animal. And really even the third album was kind of, looks like they were kind of moving towards the concerto. You could kind of tell that they wanted to do something orchestral. They'd gotten away from the poppier things they were doing on the first 2 albums, but I like the first 2 records a hell of a lot. If they had continued in that vein, never even done anything orchestral and never done anything with Gillan and Glover, I'd still like them. I'd still think they were a pretty good band. I'm not saying I regret Gillan and Glover. I mean, come on, let's be serious here. I love Mark II. But Mark I, they were decent. They were, nobody really pays attention. It's just Hush and I guess Ring That Neck gets played now and then, but there's really not much else from those records that anybody ever would hear. And Ring That Neck doesn't usually sound the same because the sound on that album was a lot different than what they eventually went to. It was just a really interesting period. I liked what they were doing. I wish they'd, done more of it, but not really at the expense of doing Mark I. So you can't have everything. There's only so much time and only so many records you can get. But it's well worth checking out if you like that kind of thing. And I avoided a lot of picks with this. I didn't really introduce the topic, which I kind of had meant to do. I avoided a lot of picks like King Crimson or something, where the problem with them is that, maybe, they certainly changed with Court of the Crimson King, and Wake of Poseidon sounding like this, and then later, the other stuff sounds different from that. Way different in most cases. But the problem is that you go to the person on the street and you say, quick, name a King Crimson song. And they'll say, what? Because they probably can't, right? I mean, we can, but they're just not popular enough. So to me, they're kind of a genre band. They're a cult band. And if you're into them, you're going to look at everything. That said, I would almost consider Genesis, the early Genesis, to be some of that. And I had no idea the first album was different. So I learned something from you, David. That was cool. I'm actually going to go check that out because that sounds like something I might like. So anyway, Deep Purple, that's my third pick. And I do have a bunch of honorables if we get to that.
All right, cool. All right, Phil, you're up.
All right, my next choice is in the realm of psychedelia. I think a rather obvious choice. I just have to put this out there, starting, of course, with this album right here, Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd. First album of Pink Floyd with Syd Barrett, of course, at the helm, with Roger Waters, obviously, Richard Wright, Nick Mason on the drums. What can be said about this album? And then, of course, the next one here, Saucer Full of Secrets, where we get also David Gilmour, and basically Syd Barrett has gone at that point. This could kind of fit in with that other panel you guys did about I wish they had made another album with that lineup. Early Pink Floyd, right? Psychedelic. The first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, sounds like Beatles on tons and tons of acid. You have songs on Piper, obviously, like Astronomy Domine, which is that kind of dark, psychedelic, experimental thing. And then you have a kind of totally silly, but at the same time, very angular, weird tune like Bike, which kind of is heralding the whole Britpop maybe thing, together, of course, with the Beatles. And then you get more experimentation and generally very angular kind of music with Saucer Full of Secrets, and then also a little bit with Obscured by Clouds, where now Syd Barrett is gone, and in his place obviously is David Gilmour. Amagama, which I don't have a physical copy of, is a very difficult album, very avant-garde, but also in that kind of realm of psychedelia, experimenting a lot with ear candy and with sounds and electronics and production tricks and whatnot. Obviously, for many of us, including myself, it kind of all starts with Meddle, leading then on to Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, etc., etc. Animals, right? And then The Wall. But this early stuff is really fascinating. It's a product of its time. It's very forward-thinking, very experimental. It is very avant-garde. But it is also kind of difficult, eclectic. It's not something you could just play like that. You have to maybe be in the right kind of mood, or I don't know, take something in order to somehow enjoy it. I'm not sure. But anyway, Pink Floyd, early Pink Floyd, first 3 or 4 albums. Yeah.
There you go. All right, cool. Thanks. All right, David, you're up.
Okay. My last one, instead of a band, I went with an artist. I went with Tori Amos. Now, her first album of the band was actually called Why Can't Tori Read? Came out in 1988. I didn't even know this album existed when I first started really getting into her later stuff, because she essentially disowned it for years until it was finally reissued in 2017. And like Matt Sorum from Guns N' Roses later on, he actually plays drums on the album. So it was more of she was obviously the focal point of the band, but it was more of a group effort at that point. And obviously, as you can tell from the cover, it's definitely, you got that 80s glam look. I mean, her hair is all teased with hairspray and everything.
She looks a lot like Kate Bush there, something like
I was thinking the same thing. There may have been some influence there. So, yeah, it's definitely a synth pop album. She was working with like the producers from Kajagoogoo, so you definitely get that very dated 80s synth pop sound. And it's it's definitely, of the three examples I had for today, I think this is probably the most drastic, because by the time she decides to go solo and she puts out like an album like Little Earthquakes from 1991, where she pretty much goes full on piano, and then her lyrics and just the themes she wants to deal with, she started getting really like political, dealing with like gender and sexual politics. And a lot of her lyrics were pretty raw and fearlessness, the way she presented herself. And then she kept building. It was album after album. And then when she gets to Under the Pink, she starts dealing with religion. And then Boys for Pele from 96, it might be her best album. I think the first three solo albums she put out are probably what most fans would consider like the sweet spot of her career. But yeah, until she came out with even like the last album she put out was pretty good, but she's never really acknowledged that portion of her career from the 80s until the past few years, when there's actually a song on the album called Fire on the Side, and she actually started incorporating that into her solo set now. But yeah, this was an album I didn't know existed until a few years ago, and like original vinyl copies of it go for a lot of money now because it was basically axed by the record company at the time. But yeah, if you get a chance, it might be something worth checking out if you're a fan of her later stuff, only because you can see just how drastic the change was.
Sweet.
Awesome. Cool.
Nice,
All right.
nice.
That's actually,
Well, go ahead, Jeff.
there's sort of an interesting point there, I think, that something that we see now that we didn't see like as much, say, in the 70s when all these bands were in their heydays, or were a lot of them were, or the 80s. But now, bands that are still going seem to be a little more inclined to drag out old songs they didn't play before. And whether that's because they've got a new appreciation, they've reconciled themselves with something they weren't sure they liked for a while, or just the fans wanted it, or they're just sick of playing the old stuff, the stuff they always played. Whatever reason there might be, and I'm not any expert on this because I don't really see a lot of concerts these days, but it feels like there is kind of a resurgence. I keep hearing about that, where stuff gets dragged out that, was ignored for a long time. I just find it interesting. There might be a show in that. I mean, who knows? I wouldn't really have any good examples for it, but somebody else probably. So, sorry, carry on, Martin. I just wanted to...
All right.
Okay. My last choice, again, to keep it a theme, I went with the Saints. I'm Stranded, the great Australian punk band. This is a really ferocious, really dirty guitar album. The guitars are so high in the mix. The drums are back. The vocals are back and coagulated. There's what the band looked like. Actually more punky looking than if you dressed up like punks. I think it's just a great shot of the band. And then, of course, the second album is actually still quite heavy, but it's much more accomplished, riffy, more, well put together. But after that, everything they did after that is, we got the bootleg album, we've got the Monkey Puzzle. After that, they essentially, Prehistoric Sounds was the first one. So the second album was early 78 and then late 78. But after that, they became more of like a Waterboys, REM, maybe a little Dexys Midnight Runners in there. So there's some horns, but it's mostly like acoustic guitar, a Celtic band, maybe a little Pogsy. This was the one that was a little bit of a hit with Just Like Firewood off of this 1987. And then this one came out, kind of the same look and same sort of thing. Yeah, just very, very kind of art rock, alternative, not art rock, but more like traditional acoustic, strummy, with drums and stuff. There's another one. So, it's kind of a weird pick because, and some of these, I almost feel like it's the heavy first two albums that are the most celebrated by the Saints anyways, rather than the later stuff. So it's a bit of a cheat, but the first two are just very different from the next ones. I was shocked when I got Prehistoric Sounds as an import. It was, like I say, acoustic guitars, mellow, nothing very riffy on it. And I'll just rattle through my honorable mentions. The Adverts kind of fits that as well. but they had a punk album and then only one other album, and so doesn't really fit. Thin Lizzy's a good obvious one for the first two Thin Lizzy albums being very folky, and then they get a little heavier as time goes on. Rush is an obvious one that was mentioned by you, Phil. But yeah, the first one's Zeppelin-esque and John Rutsey. Pantera, obviously, the early stuff, more hair metal-y, technical metal, power metal. I think Cheap Trick's first album is different from the rest of them, a little more raw. Hawkwind was mentioned, not for this reason, but yeah, Hawkwind almost has an album like the Genesis situation, where the first one is very different. They just really come up with their sound on the second album moving forward. Gillan, I felt, is different lineup on the first one, the Japanese album. Anthrax, Fistful of Metal. Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love. Very strange sounding eclectic band on that first album, and then that was gone by the second album. David Bowie's first one, we know that's kind of like a poppy singer-songwritery album. He had two self-titled debuts. Saxon's first album was not very new wave of British heavy metal. I think Aerosmith's first album is very amateurish versus Get Your Wings. Jethro Tull was mentioned with This Was. We got Moody Blues with Magnificent Moody's, Status Quo with Pictures, Match Stickable, etc. We got Scorpions with Lonesome Crow. That's all of mine.
The all-inclusive Martin.
There you go.
But my pick was gonna be the David Bowie. Mm-hmm. But I will say that first album, it's very heavily influenced by that music hall style, vaudeville. It's got a lot of that British pop of that time. Yeah. It's almost theatrical, whimsical, you might say. Little touch of
it's like the Genesis, right? It's really quite a bit like From Genesis to Revelation.
Yeah, and that kind of carried over onto his second album, which was titled Space Oddity in 1969. So the first Bowie album came out in 67. There's a break in between. The second album, of course, it's on a different label, came out on RCA. Was retitled Space Oddity here, but in the UK it was still titled David Bowie, but it still kind of had some of that, but it shifts a little bit more to that folk rock, psychedelic space rock. Maybe you could probably consider that space rock. It's a lot more cohesive than the debut, but this is where he found himself, because Space Oddity, that kind of put him in motion for what was coming later. So, but I think that those first two albums are a bit of an outlier compared to what came later, especially that first album, Martin, at 100%. But I kind of put those two second album in there together. So
nice.
That's my other pick. To elaborate on it. So
yeah. Also in that camp, Warren Zevon definitely had one way outlier before he got his sound. And then I don't know my Elton John, but didn't Elton John do the same thing?
Didn't he have a record like in 67 or something?
Yeah. What about Billy Joel with Attila? Or Bruce Springsteen with whatever they were called, Steelhouse or whatever they were called, right? Remember he had that.
Or are you thinking Michael Bolton? No, who was in Steelhouse?
Bruce Springsteen had.
I think it was Steel Mill.
Steel Mill. Yeah. And Michael Bolton had Blackjack, but Michael Bolton had two albums as Blackjack.
And Rex. What about Rex?
Well, yeah, Rex had the two heavy albums and then became the pop guy.
Yeah. That's a pretty drastic.
But that was
change.
a band. That was a band called Rex. Whole different people, but
you could say, hey, Alice Cooper, the band, and what he did later.
No, but plus also Pretty for You and Easy Action are the wacky Zappa-esque ones on Frank's label, and then he goes over to Warner, and all the rest by the band are all similar, right?
Yep. Yeah. There you go. Anybody else have any honorable mentions? We can wrap this dog up early.
I got a couple.
Go ahead.
I had UFO on there, but that's been well covered. Status Quo has been mentioned. I do have a counter example just for the hell of it, but a couple other examples. Def Leppard. I remember looking at compilations and stuff, and like that first album doesn't even exist. And I would trade all the rest of the Def Leppard albums for On Through the Night. I really like On Through the Night, and that I actually was of age and hearing it on Chicago radio. I heard Rock Brigade a few times, so Most of the new wave of British heavy metal I didn't find out about until much later. But that one particular song I did actually hear when it was current. I don't know why. I don't know why Chicago was playing, but they were. There's a lot of that kind of stuff. And Crocus does this. Well, Crocus is a great. Anytime you're talking about change, Crocus is like the canonical example, it seems like. But they did this at least 3 times, because I would consider that with Mark Storace, that's the definitive sound of Crocus. But the first album was really weird and kind of proggy. The second album was more of a kind of a boogie kind of thing-ish. I mean, it's got some of that on it. And then they went to try to do a more metal boogie kind of thing, like a heavier Fog Hat, for a while, until they got Storace in. So the 70s albums, Paid and Metal and that kind of stuff, had you could see where they were eventually getting their, they were trying to move towards a sound, but they just didn't have the vocals for it. And the guy, he eventually just played bass. He wasn't really a lead singer for that kind of stuff. And as soon as the first Storace album happened, first song on there, Heat Strokes, it's like, okay, now we know what Crocus is supposed to sound like. And then the rest of the album wasn't all that great, but they did set the template and go on from there. So,
yeah, that debut from Crocus sounds like it's from an Eastern European country that doesn't even exist anymore. It's just the weirdest, most out there, wacky. Where are these guys picking up their influences? It sounds like it's beyond influence. It's the strangest record.
Yeah, and I think it was only the bass player, Chris Van Roer, that was later the singer. I think he was the only member in there, and everybody else left, before the second album, which they've done a couple of times. I remember noticing in their discography that there was one spot, it was my favorite Crocus fact, where nobody from one particular album was on the next album. It was different people from the classic lineup, so they all had a right to call themselves Crocus, sure. Fine, no argument, but it was just funny that there wasn't a single member that played on both.
Yeah,
I thought that was hilarious. And my counterexample is Therion. Their first album does not sound anything like the rest of their catalog. And the reason they're not an example and they're a counterexample is because I don't think it's very good. I mean, it's just kind of a generic death metal sound, and it's all right, I guess. But like, I listened to it, I was like, oh yeah, this is different, and then I just never went back to it because there just wasn't anything that grabbed me on there. Whereas, after that, they turned into a band that kind of defined their own sound, and they forged a new sound. I really like bands that do that. I got a lot of respect for that. So. And I guess you could almost argue Maiden, but anyway, sorry, go ahead, Martin.
Oh, no, I've got nothing to add. I mean, except for the fact that, when you bring up Therion, you could think of probably 7 or 8 or 9 of those bands that started as black metal bands and became prog metal bands, right?
Yeah, probably so. Like Fate's Warning, maybe. So. All right. Anyway, that's my honorables.
Awesome. Anybody else?
Okay, I'll just quickly add, continuing from what I mentioned earlier with Pink Floyd, in 1992, Steven Wilson, who to this day claims that his favorite band of all time is Pink Floyd, and he adores Ummagumma, he records his first ever album as Porcupine Tree, playing basically almost everything himself. The first album is called On the Sunday of Life in 1992. Then later in 93, he did Up the Downstair, where he gets Colin Edwin on the bass and Richard Barbieri on the keyboards, who would later stick with him throughout the career of Porcupine Tree. And in 95, he does The Sky Moves Sideways. These three albums are not entirely a far cry from what comes later with Signify, Lightbulb Sun, Stupid Dream, and of course In Absentia. But they are more in that psychedelic realm, early Pink Floyd, experimental. This guy who's recording all this stuff in his room, and he's just like playing with all these toys of like, music recording and sound engineering and whatever, just making a lot of weird sounds and ear candy and long duration stuff with like wind blowing and whatever, psychedelic experimental stuff. But it's really cool. And it's really nice to listen to get an idea of where Porcupine Tree started and how they morphed from that kind of experimental psychedelic thing into that very special thing that is Porcupine Tree, which you could say is prog, but it's not easily pigeonholed. Brilliant. And of course, to finish, I have to mention Gentle Giant with their first self-titled album in 1971 with Acquiring the Taste, where you do hear what Gentle Giant would be later with Three Friends and Octopus, but I think they still hadn't fully realized their sound and what they exactly wanted to play. I think it's all there, the theatricality, the classical music, the avant-garde stuff, the jazziness, the atonality, with a bit of British blues boom, but it's kind of all over the place. So I think it came together after those first two albums, in the case of Gentle Giant. And everything else, I think we exhausted every single band almost. So there you
go. We've reached the end, ladies and gentlemen. David, do you have any more?
No, I was going to mention Gentle Giant, but he touched on it. So.
All right, let's wrap this dog up. I want to thank the panel here tonight. Another great discussion. We do want to hear from you in the chat. Give us some more examples. I dare you to find more than Martin found. I'm just going to throw it out there. Let's see if you can beat Martin. But it's always fun to talk music, and that's all we're here to do. So if you'd like to be on these panels, you could be on these panels. We'd love to have you. We have a Patreon down below. You can join up. We have a lot of great content coming out all the time. We also have a Ko-fi. Buy us a pint or a cup of coffee. That'd be awesome. We like donations too. We like money. We do this because we like to talk music, like I always say. Also, we have merch. Get yourself a shirt. You deserve it. Anyway, anything you can do to help out the channel, we appreciate it. So what's next on the Contrarians? I don't know. I'll have something for you. This could be this. But stay tuned. We have a lot more great content. I want to thank the panel, Jeff, Phil, David, of course, Martin, and myself, and we will see you on the next one.
Bye, guys.
All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.